Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today in the Disruptive University podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Purnama. My special guest for today is Dean Strang, criminal defense attorney based in Madison, Wisconsin. He's recently featured in the award-winning documentary Making a Murderer. Dean and I talked about his career and his background and how that pans out as a criminal defense attorney that I think is influential to many of us who've seen the documentary. This is my talk with him, and I hope you enjoy it.
All right.
Hello. Hi, Dean. Well, I'm glad we can make this happen. I've been very looking forward to this, so thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking me.
So let me ask you first, if you're a Badger fan.
By birth, yes. by birth. But I'm not fanatic, if that makes any sense. So since the release of Making a Murderer in 2015, you've accumulated a substantial number of screen time, if I might call that. When I did the research for this interview, there are upwards of about 60 videos on YouTube featuring you, and this excludes, portions of the documentary. Yeah, so 8 podcasts and gazillions of articles that I've read about you alone. Yet none has really explored you as a person, as a lawyer, and also as an educator. So I hope to fill this gap in this, representation of you, Dean Strang, as a figure, so to speak. So I would like to go back to the earlier years and ask you, what was your upbringing like, and how was it at home, and were your parents academic or not, and how was learning facilitated when you were growing up, so to speak? Well, neither one of my parents were academics at all, although there's a caveat to that. Both of my parents went to college, and indeed my dad had a master's degree in what today would be called a master's in business administration. But he was an engineer by trade, manufacturing engineer. He had a bit of an anti-academic bent, honestly. My mother was a school teacher by training, primary education. What we call, her favorite age group was what we would call between 2nd and 4th graders here. So 7 to 9-year-old children. She did not have an anti-academic bent. She was interested in learning. She was quite curious about the world, loved poetry. And both of them, though, encouraged achievement at school for me and from my sister, who's just over a year younger. So, from a very early age, it was clear that our parents expected us to go on to college after a high school degree. That was just instilled in us that we were expected to do that, and academic achievement was respected and honored, at least superficially, by my dad, in that he, if you didn't get an A, he wanted to know why you didn't get an A, and why you hadn't worked hard enough, and what you were going to do about that in the future. And I think for my mother, probably she was less focused on the obvious emblems of academic success and more interested in
whether you really were learning, whether you were interested in learning, whether you were curious about the world, and developing a reasonably broad education. So they were very supportive parents. Financially, we were solidly in what Americans would call the middle class. There was never a question about whether there was going to be food on the table at night. I was very, very fortunate to have parents who loved one another, loved the two of us kids, and provided everything we reasonably could need.
Right. And if I may ask, why was your dad anti-academic, and what precipitated his view on this specific issue?
He had struggled in school. Reading came to him with some difficulty. He was a very poor speller. Probably today, in early childhood, they could have diagnosed reasons for that and given him support that he would have needed to enjoy school better. But I think he viewed school as a travail and something to be gotten through so that you could get on to doing something productive in the world. My mother had a different view. I think she saw learning as something that was intrinsically important, worthy in itself.
Right. Now, looking back on how your parents raised you and your sister, do you think that there's something specifically or quintessentially American or specific about the American way of parenting or raising children? And what would be the core characteristics, if there's such a thing?
I don't know that there is such a thing because, of course, I'm constrained by my own experience, the way we all are.
Right.
I was born, as I say, into white, middle class, middle America circumstances. And, so we looked in many ways like the nuclear family that television shows were presenting to Americans at the time. A white dad, a white mom, and two smiling little white children, with a initially a 2-bedroom house with a den that I slept in, and then later a 4-bedroom house. So we moved from the city of Milwaukee out to the suburbs when I was young. So we fit one stereotype, I guess, of an American household, but that's only one limited model of what a household could look like or parenting looked like at the time. So I wouldn't press my experience on anyone else,
Right.
other than to say I clearly was very fortunate.
Fair enough. I was wondering whether, for instance, this idea of independent thinking, of critical thinking that's instilled early on in an American household, which is, I could say that from my experience, being brought up in a third world country like Indonesia, obviously, we were told not to think independently, or at least at school or at home, we had to conform and abide to so many different ideologies, if you want to call that. So I was wondering whether it's different in your household or American household in general.
In my household, it was different than that. One of my dad's strengths, and there probably you could attribute some weaknesses to this too, but I view it primarily as a strength that he had, was my dad was really a pretty fierce individualist. Believed that we had to take personal responsibility for our destinies, believed that all things were possible to you if you worked hard, and that you ought not be constrained to follow others or to adopt a herd mentality. Now I'm putting these in words he might have used. And in that sense, he was very encouraging of a divergent opinion. He liked to provoke me. He loved talking politics to me from a really quite young age, 7, 8, 9 years old. He was trying to engage me in current affairs. He was very interested in those himself. And believed in participatory democracy. He wrote to our legislators. He wrote to the people who represented him in the state legislature and the United States Congress, and really did value the possibilities of an individual and the importance of developing your own view and learning to defend that and hear others. And so in that sense, there might be something American about that. But again, I've not lived in another country. 2.5 months is the longest time I've ever spent continuously in another country. So it's really very hard to step out of my own experience and evaluate that against other models and other ways of being.
Right. It's hard to generalize this experience across the board. I totally understand. And where was this 2.5 months abroad? Did you spend time?
That was a summer trimester in what was then still called Leningrad. The summer of 1981, I spent in the USSR studying in Leningrad, and we also got to travel around a little bit.
Right. That must have been an experience. One hell of an experience, I suppose.
That was a great experience.
Yeah.
It really was a great experience. It was at a time when we were still very much in the throes of Cold War thinking. The Soviet Union was mostly a closed country. Americans had little more than caricatures, really, of what Russian people or the people of various Soviet republics were like. We were focused very much on USSR leadership, but had only the vaguest notions of what daily life was like there, and the culture. So getting a chance to be immersed in it, even just for 2.5 months, and finding universal connections to people in spite of the superficial separation of our two countries, was really important for me. Trying to make my way in another language was important and is important, I think, for everybody. One of the things I regret most about my own education is my lack of skill in other languages, and the lack of emphasis that other languages had when I was in primary and secondary school.
I have a question about the relevance of liberal arts and humanities studies later in my interview, so we're going to come back to that. But I'm also curious. A lot of people have observed, and I can also attest to this, that what drove many of us to you and the Making a Murder is your incredible sense of compassion. So I wonder, in what ways was your upbringing harness this specific trait? I know it's hard to reverse engineer it probably in some sense, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit about this.
Well, I can speculate. My mother was a very empathetic, compassionate person. She really was. She just had enormous reserves of empathy and compassion for other people. She's one of the very few people I've ever known who lived the creed that if you can't say something nice about someone, don't say anything at all. She really did try to live that creed. My father, without becoming too psychological or I hope offering too much information, my father's thyroid failed when he was 10 or 12 years old. And so, and in his day, I don't think they had a very effective way to treat that. So he became greatly overweight as a boy. By 12 years old, he was just obese. And this led to teasing, ostracism as a child that really affected him severely for life, his image of himself. I never saw my dad in a sweater. I never saw him in a pullover shirt. He was somebody who physically thought of himself as an oddity and a subject of scorn. I think he felt shame about it. And that gave him, in maturity, I think, some ability to recognize just how hard it can be for people who are struggling with an obstacle not of their making. Weight in his case, but it could have been a lack of intellect or an impoverished upbringing. It could have been a physical disability. It gave him a fairly acute sense of the role of luck, good or bad, in who we become and how easy or hard life is for us. So I think while my mother was the more broadly empathetic and compassionate person, my dad had a kind of acuity on some of those issues that has stuck with me. It was impossible not to recognize some of the pain my dad carried with him from childhood. It was impossible not to appreciate that because he never really fully overcame it. And in fact, I think struggled for self-image and self-worth all his life, worked very hard at his job to achieve and, to be viewed as somebody who was successful and a full participant in society. He worked very hard at that. I think that for a lot of reasons, people who knew both of my parents and know me would say Dean probably more resembles his mother in many respects, including physically. But in much broader ways than that. Although, my parents' friends say they see a bit of my dad in me too. That's not surprising. I guess all of us fortunate enough to have, two parents who really cared for us probably would be able to say that.
Just to bounce off of that, another thing that is also, to me, so influential about you is your mastery of oral presentation and argument. And when I read Jerry Buting's book, there's one passage that I like to quote here, specifically on this point, in which he says, and here I quote, "Dean's eloquence was known to me long before we represented Avery, and Making a Murderer captured him speaking naturally and profoundly in fluid prose. It was no accident that some of the most memorable statements in the documentary came out of his mouth. After Cancratz complained that the state would be put at such a disadvantage by a legal ruling that it would be like swimming upstream, Dean famously replied, 'All due respect to counsel, the state is supposed to start every criminal case swimming upstream, and the strong current against which the state is supposed to be swimming is the presumption of innocence.'" End of quote. So your ability to come up with spot-on, brilliant, and impromptu remarks that are so evocatively memorable, I wonder, how did this develop? Is again, your upbringing years had something to do with that, or did you develop this later in your college years or university years or professional years?
First of all, understand that Jerry is being overly generous, as he's wont to do. But beyond that, I think that my refuge in words started pretty early. Part of it is when I say my mother was a teacher at the primary school level, English was her principal academic focus, like her mother before her, who also had been an English teacher. And that grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was very much a stickler about grammar, using English properly by her lights. And she did not hesitate to correct me or correct my sister, for that matter, correct my mother and my father when she thought that we had put something ungrammatically or even inelegantly. So, I had early on a sense that the language was important and ought to be respected. But more importantly than that, really, is the fact that I was undersized into college. I was a very small kid. And I could not use my fists to solve problems. That early on I learned would lead to disastrous consequences with bigger boys getting the better of me physically every time. And so I learned to talk my way out of trouble. I mean, that's the truth. I had to talk my way out of trouble because I could not fight my way out of it successfully. So I am very aware of those junctures in my childhood where by talking, I was able to avoid a physical confrontation. Now, how you turn that into adulthood with, somebody who grew late but eventually grew. I'm of more or less average size now and have been since I was 19 or so. But I think, I talked about early childhood patterns and lasting effects with my dad, and with me, it really was, you better learn to use your mouth effectively because otherwise you're going to get beat up a whole lot.
Was there a lot of situations in which you had to confront your classmates or your peers
No, just normal childhood stuff.
Right.
Just, nothing specially confrontational about my childhood, but little boys get into scraps, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can continue to do that. And indeed, some boys and men continue that all their lives.
I think your propensity to avoid physical confrontation, I think it's also demonstrated in your calmness. And here I'd like to also bring in another quote from Jerry Buting's Illusion of Justice, in which there's one episode in which you managed to calm him down when he was I think he was very upset with prosecutor Kratz. And then let me just read it. He says, "Calm restored, Judge Willis decided that he would read back that part of the testimony. We returned to the courtroom as if nothing had happened. Later, when we were on our own, Zen Master Strang had a comment about the conversation in chambers. I'm sorry I didn't let you get at least one punch in," Dean said. So I guess this is an evidence, perhaps, to that propensity to avoid physical contact. But your calmness also, would you say that it's also something that you learned during this important years growing up?
Well, I'm not a calm person overall. I'm prone to a fair amount of anxiety, but I try to mask that. I think that behaving anxiously or behaving frantically doesn't work very well in the main. The episode Jerry's describing really happened, by the way, but you have to understand again that he's being both generous and even magnanimous in his description of me there. And as I say, I think in general life goes better and more progress is made more quickly in relationships with other people if you're able to remember to listen to them and really take in what they're saying and then react calmly or in a measured and thoughtful way. I'm someone who avoids conflict of any kind every time I can, which I grant you means I'm in a strange profession, or at least a strange area of the legal profession, where I'm involved in an adversary process all the time. But the fact is, I avoid conflict whenever I can. It's a fault, as well as a strength at times. And I think calmness is a way to deflect conflict.
I agree with that. I want to pivot our conversation to your experiences at university. You went to Dartmouth College?
I did.
And was it at the time that you developed this interest in political cartooning? Or that came later?
No, the political cartooning came well before college. I was drawing cartoons since I was about 8. Initially not very political. They were more, what we would call cartoon strips, funny comics. But by the time I was in what we would call junior high school, by the time I was 12, 13, and then going into high school at age 14, I was very interested in politics and current affairs and turned my cartooning to that forum, if you will. So that antedated college.
Right. And given the climate or the culture of grassroots political activism in Wisconsin, I mean, if we're talking about publications such as the Progressive magazine or The Onion that was rooted in Wisconsin, even Madison. How did that influence you? Did that develop or impact on your political sensibility at all?
That's as hard a question as it is good to answer, because it really is hard, isn't it, to unpack the things that have influenced us. It's hard to say, what's the content of the air I've breathed, and how does that differ from, the content of the air, so to speak, or the ambient culture around me, had I been somewhere else that I never was. But I think what I can say is that, yes, in many ways, Wisconsin was the cradle of the progressive era in the United States, meaning, roughly the late 1880s to the end of the 1920s, capital P progressive era. To a large extent, that came to be in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest in the United States, the Great Lakes region. Progressivism became so structurally kind of enmeshed in life here, or built into our ways of local government, state government in Wisconsin, the university system, that it is in a sense just ambient. It's there, and it's very hard for me to attribute causes, to my own development to that, other than to say, we are all, to some extent, a product of our environment. I notice now that that progressive heritage is under very methodical and deliberate attack by those who ideologically view progressive ideas as mistakes and as harmful relics of the past. There's a very methodical, and I say this with some grudging admiration, in the sense that it's an organized, intellectually coherent attack on progressive ideals and the progressive heritage. So I can look now at the dismantling of some of our progressive heritage in Wisconsin and see that, because it represents a change from a status quo that I largely took for granted, as I say, in the way that most of us do, until we're forced to step outside our own culture or our own upbringing and look at the world afresh from some distance.
And what would be the latest manifestation of this dismantling of this progressive heritage in Wisconsin specifically?
There are several, but the idea of the university as a core financial commitment of state government, the university system is being questioned sharply, and that idea is being eroded. Unionism, trade unionism, or the collective action of not just wage earners but people in a variety of callings, is under attack. This all gets pretty local, but I'm trying to think of some broad ways in which some of those progressive ideals are being stripped away, disassembled. I think in general, a progressive ideal was reliance on expertise, commitment of public problems to civil servants or stable institutions that were staffed with experts. So just to take one example, for example, just to give you one example, workplace injuries and a workplace and a compensation system for workers who were injured on the job was a progressive idea and instituted, if not first in Wisconsin, then very early as compared to the rest of the country. And those claims could be made easily, and ultimately they were reviewed by a commission of experts who would decide the validity of a claim. That system, in part, has been dismantled now, and the trust in expert commissions as independent arms of government or independent institutions within government is much diminished, and I think viewed as a worse idea than having direct and frequently unstable popular control over some of those functions, or removing those functions from government altogether and leaving them to sort of a vague notion of the marketplace or the arena.
This is an example of what Michael Sandel, the philosopher, would call the marketization of social life. So
yes, it is one small example of what Sandel is describing with that term. That's exactly right. Thomas Piketty has, lately commented in some of the same areas.
Now, speaking of the university, after Dartmouth, you went to University of Virginia School of Law, and I believe it was your aunt or a member of the family who gave you the idea to pursue law, correct?
My dad's sister, one of my dad's two sisters, was the lawyer in the family. I had a great uncle on my mother's side who also was a lawyer, but I saw less of him, and he was, another generation removed from me. My dad's next older sister was physically proximate to us. She lived in Chicago.
Right.
She was the nearest relative, just 90 miles away from where we grew up on the south side of Milwaukee. So we saw a fair amount of that aunt, and she was someone my dad admired for her intelligence, for educational accomplishment. She had found school, I think, easier than he did, and had achieved at a higher level, and he respected that a great deal. So I had the role model of my aunt, and also knew that although she had gone to one of the best law schools in the United States then and now, the University of Michigan Law School, and had graduated very near the top of her class, that was in 1952, and it took her 3 years to find a job as a lawyer, because she was a woman, pure and simple. Had she been a man with those credentials, she would have had a job in 3 minutes. It took her 3 years, and she made an enormous commitment of self to become and remain a lawyer. And that was a very moving exemplar that was close at hand because she was my aunt, and I knew her well, and she had a wonderful relationship with me and my sister when we were younger. So that the idea that being a lawyer represented attainment and required intelligence was before me pretty early on, and my dad encouraged me to become a lawyer, probably because he thought at least it was a more stable career choice than cartooning.
Mm-hmm. And did you also realize that that going to law school would guarantee a lifelong security and a steady employment, if you want to call it?
You know, I blithely assumed that in the way that 21-year-olds assume things. Mm-hmm. I later understood that it is not so, that there are cycles in the legal market, just as there are in all job markets, and that there are dangers that frequently befall lawyers, just as there are dangers that frequently befall people who do any type of work. But you're right. I mean, in the sense that at the age where I applied and entered law school, I assumed that it would mean a reliable and comfortable salary, a sort of social status that I probably couldn't articulate at the time, but, probably in some vague way, I think I saw myself as meeting parental expectations and on a trajectory to live as comfortably, at least, as my parents had. Mm-hmm. All those assumptions I would have made at the time without examining why they might have been unsound.
Mm-hmm. And specifically during your time at the University of Virginia School of Law, were there specific professors or faculty that inspired you, or even figures within the legal history of the world that opened your eyes and gave you this idea that you want to go and to become a criminal defense lawyer, and a specific one which is defending people who are otherwise being subjugated or not in a very powerful position? And you mentioned people like Bernard Rolling and the Indian judge Radha Binod Pal, which they both held important positions as judges at the Tokyo trials, International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. And if there's one thread, I think that binds these two figures together is that they were not afraid to voice, obviously, their dissenting opinions against such a huge current of prosecuting this Japanese military officials. So were this figure already inspiring you in some way, or did you encounter other figures? I don't know if that makes sense.
Of course it does. Mine would be a better, more inspiring story if I could say yes to all of that, and I can't. I went into law school with no intention to ever set foot in a courtroom, let alone any intention to use my degree and my opportunity to serve those who had much less than I did. I can't claim any of that when I went into law school, because it just wouldn't be true. I went into law school as a second choice after abandoning cartooning, and rightly, I think maturely, abandoning cartooning as a profession that just wouldn't sustain me for 50 years or more. But I law school was then an afterthought in many respects. And you asked, did I find mentors among faculty members? And the answer to that is absolutely, I did. I had any number of really wonderful professors at the University of Virginia. One of them, for me, became especially important and helped shape me as a lawyer. I still feel the imprint of his help today. He did a great deal to shape the lawyer I became. It's a man named David Martin, who's recently retired from the active faculty, but still very much active in world affairs. I mean, his area is immigration and refugee law, so he's someone who's as important today, or more important than ever. But how I came to criminal defense was a story that comes only after law school. It took me a while. I am perpetually slow in some ways in finding my way to meaning.
And so, are you at this moment still in contact with the mentor you're talking about?
Yes. We are in contact. He's someone who's continued to be a model for me of what a lawyer can and should be.
Mm-hmm. And just to bounce off of that, since your university years played an important role to give you this sort of a mentorship and also the formal education, there's something you said that struck a chord in me when you did your talk in Amsterdam earlier this year in March. And then the discussion was about whether in the United States they should educate jurors to understand the evidence presented in the criminal case during the trial. And then you said, and here I quote, let's not confuse being educated with being intelligent, okay? We all know PhDs who don't have a lot of common sense. But we also know people who have had 8 years of formal schooling, 12 years of formal schooling, who have a lot of common sense, a lot of intelligence. So to some extent, it's a cop-out for lawyers to blame uneducated jurors to our own failures to communicate to jurors what they need to understand, end of quote. Implicit in the statement is the premise that, in this case, education, or particularly higher education, doesn't guarantee the attainment of intelligence and wisdom. And correct me if I misconstrue your line of thinking here. If it's true, then what do you think is the role of higher education today, especially in the areas of humanities and the arts, or perhaps law specifically?
You did not misconstrue me. You understood exactly what I meant to say. And I think it is very important for all of us to remember that education is not the equivalent of intelligence. Why then is education important? Because it allows us to put our intelligence to its best uses. I think it allows us ultimately to make the best contribution we personally can make to improving the world for one or two or more other people. If a life well lived is a life that serves to enhance the life experience of other people, then education gives you a wider array of paths by which you can pursue that good life. It opens up to you doors, and this is true in any country. I think this comes close to a universal, at least in our time, that education just opens up opportunities to learn how the world works, and to try to address the ways in which the world doesn't work very well. It gives you access to the places where problems can be viewed and solutions can be proposed and tried. So I do think education is enormously important. I also think it cannot be confused with native intelligence, with the traits that all of us have a chance to develop, or should have a chance to develop, regardless of the formal educational attainment we have. That is, you can be a compassionate person. You can be a passionate person. You can be a practical problem solver. You can be thoughtful. You can listen to other people. You can test your own ideas objectively or fairly. You can do all of these things without any formal education at all. Formal education just gives you, I think, as I say, a broader array of opportunities to pursue a good life, of trying to make this often hard world a little bit easier for some other people.
Yeah. And considering the fact that today there's preponderance of knowledge out there that you can access at the tip of your hand on your smartphone, on your laptop. If you go to YouTube, if you want to learn something, there's always content available for that. So in turn,
yeah, there is, and there again, information isn't synonymous with intelligence either. There's an awful lot of people who've acquired either a high level of education or have mastered a great level of information, at least seemingly mastered that, who are in fact ignorant. And there are a lot of uneducated people, you've known them, I've known them, a lot of uneducated people who are in fact wise, a fair amount of wisdom, or a great deal of wisdom. So, we cannot confuse the acquisition and management of information with intelligence any more than we would confuse the acquisition of an advanced degree with intelligence. The value of information and the value of education, it seems to me, are just in expanding for us our opportunities to apply our intelligence, to apply our decency, to apply our integrity, and to develop wisdom, ideally for the benefit of others.
I completely agree with that. When I ask my students whether they would like to enroll in courses that are primarily online without any intervention from a physical person, almost 90% would say no, because they like someone to guide them, to encourage them, to instill passion in them. So
that itself is very encouraging to me.
Absolutely.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. This gives us hope. So I only have a couple of questions, Dean, since we are running out of time. You teach at University of Wisconsin Law School. as an adjunct professor as well as at Marquette University Law School?
Neither one anymore, or at least not regularly.
Right.
I am teaching at the University of Virginia School of Law as an adjunct lecturer now, and also lecture in continuing studies at the University of Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. I see. But be that as it may, what is your approach to teaching? And is there a specific strategy that you take in terms of delivering a lecture or training students? Or, and does this come intuitively because of your profession, so to speak?
I don't think it's intuitive, and I don't think I have a strategy. I have a point of view that's been useful to me, I think. And that is simply that teaching is impossible, but learning is very possible. You cannot teach, but you can learn. And what I mean by that is that, to my mind, if we examine our own experience and examine human experience around us, nobody's ever been taught to do anything. Anything. You learned to walk because you saw that those who walked could get a cookie out of the cookie jar on the counter. You learned to tie your shoes because everybody else was tying their shoes. And if you could wear shoes and walk, you could walk farther and explore more of the world. You learned to drive a car because that gave you access to yet a larger field of the world. You learned to read and write because you admired people who could. You had before you examples of people who were able to do exciting things because they read and write. And the people we call our teachers have done nothing more nor less than inspire us to want to learn what they know. They've shown that they're excited about geometry, or they're excited about electrical engineering, or they're excited about Asian history, or whatever it is. They demonstrated an excitement about it. They've demonstrated possibilities that would open up to us if we learned what they knew. And if I'm right about this, and it is an article of faith for me that I can't teach. I can only try to help people to learn. If I'm right about that, then it takes all the pressure off you in teaching, in a sense. You really have only to let your own enthusiasm for the subject show, and to be authentic in a classroom about your enthusiasms and about what you know or believe. You have only to demonstrate a willingness to re-examine what you know in the hope of pushing further ahead in your understanding of an area. It really does take the pressure off you to realize you're not teaching these people a damn thing. If you're lucky, and if you're doing it right, you are helping or encouraging or inspiring them to learn.
Absolutely. And passion and enthusiasm are very contagious.
They are.
Absolutely.
For good and for ill.
Yeah.
When you're really learning something that's worthwhile, that potentially will offer a pathway to a good life, to making the world a little better for other people. When you're really learning in any endeavor like that, I think passion is a very positive force. It's a very good force.
Positive force. I like that phrasing. Let us get out of the university and educational atmosphere and then talk about your professional career, I wonder, in your 30 plus years of lawyering career, have you ever been confronted with situations that elicit cognitive dissonance during the handling of a defense case?
Yes, of course. Of course. And by cognitive dissonance, I mean, I take that as essentially what Leon Festinger meant, which is a clash between one's stated values or his beliefs about his core values and his wishes or imperatives or externally imposed obligations at the time. And if I'm right in offering that definition of cognitive dissonance, then lawyers confront that just as almost everybody does, practically speaking, in going, through a work life. I run into it where, for example, a prosecutor's attitude or a judge's attitude may conflict sharply with my values. And at the same time, I have a professional obligation to my client to maintain a working relationship with that prosecutor or with that judge. And one just has to work through that. Mm-hmm. I think Festinger would say that, in a sense, the desires or obligations of the moment turn out to be stickier than what we believe our core values to be. Mm-hmm. The values bend to the imperatives of the moment. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of cognitive dissonance is unavoidable. The best we can do is recognize it for what it is, mm-hmm. and find a way to not abandon our core principles or values, to try to remain true to them and reconcile them with the imperatives of the moment.
Mm-hmm. The imperatives of the moment. Dean, thanks so much for coming on the show and generously spending your time with me. It's been a privilege.
Ari, thank you for having me. I've very much enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.